If you enjoyed this interesting video, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring you even more exciting and thought-provoking content. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads. Join our growing community today. Your feedback, comments, and ideas truly keep this channel alive. The gathering storm. The land was quiet before the storm. In the rolling hills of KwaZulu, the tall grasses whispered in the wind as if they knew a legend was about to rise. The people were restless, the warriors sharpening their spears, the elders looking to the skies for signs. It was the dawn of Shaka Kona, the boy who would grow into the lion of the Zulu. From a young age, Shaka carried the fire of leadership in his chest. He did not only see warriors, he saw armies moving as one body, flowing like rivers across the earth. He did not only see weapons, he saw tools of destiny that could turn fear into power. His hands shaped the ikalwa, the short stabbing spear that would change the way his people fought. His mind shaped the bullhorn formation, a strategy that would swallow enemies whole. Yet before the world knew his name, Shaka knew hardship. He grew as an outcast, a boy mocked for his lineage, hardened by rejection. In that pain, he found the steel that would one day forge an empire, far to the north, across deserts and seas. Another commander had once risen, long before Shaka's first breath. Hannibal Barca of Carthage, a son of Africa, born in the heat of struggle, had faced the might of Rome. His father had placed his small hand on a sacrificial altar and made him swear an oath of eternal hatred against Rome. That oath became his life's fire. With courage unmatched, Hannibal led his soldiers and elephants through the icy teeth of the Alps, where many thought no man could pass. Against all odds, he descended into Italy, shaking the Roman heartland with fear. His mind was sharp as a spear, his tactics precise as the strike of a lion. At Cannae, he encircled the Roman legions and crushed them so completely that generals centuries later would study his genius. These two men, separated by time, carried the same spirit. Both were children of Africa. Both knew struggle. Both refused to bow before giants. The story of Africa's commanders is not just about battles fought and enemies defeated. It is about the spirit of a people, the rhythm of drums echoing in the valleys, the roar of warriors charging with pride, the unbroken voice of a continent that says, "We are not small, we are not forgotten, we are carved from stone, and we rise." Again and again, in the firelight of a Zulu kraal, storytellers would one day sit with children gathered around, telling of Shaka's strength. In the markets of Carthage, long ago, men and women whispered of Hannibal's daring. Across centuries, the stories meet like rivers joining the sea, and their spirits rise again, not as two men, but as one legacy of African power. The first chapter of this tale belongs to the earth itself, the soil that fed their footsteps, the ancestors who carried their blood, the skies that bore witness to their courage. Before there were armies, before there were victories, there was the birth of vision. For Shaka, it was the vision of unity, a nation bound together, not scattered. Clans. For Hannibal, it was the vision of freedom, a city that would not kneel to Rome. And so, the gathering storm began. The world did not yet know, but Africa was already shaping legends who would make empires tremble. Forged in fire, the making of a commander is never easy. It begins in the ashes of hardship, in the sting of rejection, in the silence of nights where the heart beats louder than the drums. Both Shaka and Hannibal were not simply born as leaders. They were forged in fire. Shaka's fire was the cruelty of his youth. Born the illegitimate son of Kona, heir to a Zulu chiefdom, and Nandi, a proud but shamed woman, Shaka grew up with the sting of insults thrown at him like stones. He was called names that cut deep. He ate bitterness every day, but instead of breaking, he grew sharper, like iron under the hammer. He trained harder, he thought deeper, he watched how men fought, how chiefs commanded, and he promised himself that he would never bow, never again feel small. There were times when he walked alone through the valleys, his shadow long against the grass, dreaming of spears that would never shatter, of warriors who would march as one. The land itself seemed to whisper to him, the rivers speaking of power, the mountains echoing his name before he had even made it great. Hannibal's fire came from another place, another time. His father, Hamilcar Barca, was a man of war, scarred by battles with Rome. He hated Rome with a passion so fierce it burned in his household. When Hannibal was only a boy, his father took him to the temple, placed his small hand upon the altar, and made him swear that he would never be a friend of Rome. That oath was no simple child's promise. It was iron. It was destiny. It would shape the course of his life and the fate of empires. From that day, Hannibal carried Rome like a shadow on his back. Every lesson in strategy, every drill with the sword, every hour spent riding the great elephants of Carthage was a step toward that destiny. He watched his father and learned the ways of command, the movement of armies, the art of bending men to his will. Both Shaka and Hannibal understood something early in their lives. True power is not given, it is taken. It is carved out of the earth with blood, sweat, and vision. For Shaka, that vision was the unification of scattered clans into one powerful Zulu nation. For Hannibal, it was the defense of Carthage and the destruction of Rome's arrogance. Two dreams born from two fires, but both beating with the same African drum. The world they lived in was harsh. Shaka's land was a place of constant conflict, clan against clan, each one fighting for survival. Hannibal's world was no different, for Rome was rising like a storm, devouring city after city, reaching out its hand to strangle Carthage. It was as if the ancestors had tested them, saying, if you are to be leaders, then first you must learn to survive where others fall. And so, the forging began. Shaka with his spear, practicing the thrust that would one day tear through the shields of enemies. Hannibal with his elephants, mastering beasts that could crush legions underfoot. Both men looked beyond the horizon and saw not what was, but what could be. That is the mark of a true commander. They are not trapped by the present, they reach into the future and drag it back with their hands. By the time the fires of youth faded, both Shaka and Hannibal stood ready, their eyes hard, their hearts unbroken, their visions clear. They were not yet the men history would remember, but the spark was already there, burning brighter with each passing day. Africa was shaping its sons, and the world would soon tremble before them. Rise of the warrior. The day always comes when a boy must step into the skin of a man. For Shaka and Hannibal, that day came not with ceremony, but with the sound of war. Shaka's first true test came when he joined the Mthethwa army under Chief Dingiswayo. No longer the outcast boy mocked in the shadows, he now stood among men, with spears gleaming in the sun. Yet even here, he was different. While others followed orders, Shaka studied the rhythm of battle. He watched how warriors clashed like waves, but often broke apart. He asked himself, what if an army could strike as one hand, with each finger guided by the same mind? When the first clash came, Shaka did not hang back. He charged forward, shield tight, spear ready, eyes fixed not on the nearest enemy, but on the heart of the formation. He struck like lightning, quick and fierce, and the warriors beside him followed his fire. That day, Dingiswayo himself noticed the young man who fought not just with strength but with vision. He saw that Shaka was no ordinary warrior. He was a flame that could ignite nations. Far to the north, in another age, Hannibal also faced his rise. Carthage was pressed hard by Rome, and the young commander was given a chance to lead. His soldiers, hardened Phoenician men, and mercenaries from across Africa and Iberia looked to him with doubt at first. He was still young, still untested, but Hannibal carried himself with the calm of a man who already saw the battlefield's end before it began. When he led his first campaign in Iberia, his strategy was sharp as the edge of a new spear. He struck swiftly at tribes allied with Rome, crushing resistance with speed and cunning. He used terrain like a weapon, turning rivers, hills, and forests into allies. His men soon learned that following Hannibal meant victory, and victory meant survival. With every triumph, his name grew louder. Rome began to whisper it with unease. Hannibal, back in the valleys of KwaZulu, Shaka's victories under Dingiswayo brought him honor, but also envy. Other warriors muttered that he was too proud, too fierce, that he changed the old ways too quickly. Yet Shaka was not a man who bent to whispers. He shortened the spears, forcing close combat where courage mattered more than distance. He tightened formations, training his men to fight in the bullhorn style. Chest to engage, horns to encircle, loins to hold back and finish the fight. Warriors grumbled at first, but when they saw the new tactics crush enemy after enemy, their voices turned from doubt to praise. Hannibal, too, faced whispers. Roman senators mocked him as reckless, too bold, too ambitious, but boldness was his strength. When he set his eyes on Rome itself, he did what no Roman could have imagined. He marched across the Alps with his entire army and elephants. Snow, storms, hunger, and death tore at his soldiers, yet Hannibal pressed on. Many thought he would fail, but those who survived found themselves standing at the gates of Italy, the impossible made real. And in that moment, the legend of Hannibal Barca burned into history. Shaka and Hannibal shared the same truth. A leader is not measured by comfort or safety. A leader is measured by the battles he dares to fight, the burdens he dares to carry, and the vision he dares to chase. Both men had stepped from the shadows of their youth into the blazing light of command. And as the sun set on the hills of KwaZulu, and as the cold winds whipped through the Alps, two stories, though centuries apart, walked the same path. Africa was not silent, its suns were rising, and the world would soon tremble. Masters of strategy, a warrior may win battles, but a commander wins nations. What lifted Shaka Zulu and Hannibal Barca above all others was not only their courage, but their mastery of strategy, their ability to see the battlefield like a game of stones on the ground, moving men as if they were pieces in the hands of destiny. Shaka rose quickly under Dingiswayo's guidance. Where other chiefs clung to the old ways, Shaka reshaped them with the discipline of iron. He demanded that his warriors abandon the long-throwing spears and carry instead the ikalwa, a short stabbing spear meant for close combat. With the ikalwa, there was no distance, no hiding. It was man against man, courage against courage. He drilled his men to hold their shields tight, to move as one, to strike not as scattered raindrops, but as a roaring storm. The most feared of his tactics was the bullhorn formation. He would send the chest of his army to pin the enemy down, strong and unyielding. Then the horns would sweep around both sides, encircling their foes, while the loins remained hidden in reserve, waiting to finish the trapped enemy. Again and again, this strategy swallowed entire armies whole, leaving no escape. Chiefs who once dismissed him as arrogant now bowed their heads, for they had seen his vision turned into unstoppable power. Hannibal, centuries before, carved his own name into history with tactics just as brilliant. Where the Romans marched like a hammer, Hannibal moved like water, flowing around them, drawing them into traps they never saw until it was too late. At the Battle of Trebia, he lured the Romans into icy rivers, weakening them before striking from all sides. At Lake Trasimene, he hid his forces in the hills, ambushing the Romans so completely that thousands fell without even knowing from where the attack had come. But it was at Cannae where his genius shone brightest, facing a Roman army nearly twice. His size, Hannibal arranged his men in a crescent, thin in the center, strong on the sides. As the Romans pressed forward, believing they had broken his line, the crescent folded back, drawing them deeper. Then, like Shaka's horn centuries later, Hannibal's cavalry swept around, encircling the Romans until the greatest army of the ancient world was crushed, trapped like prey in a lion's jaws. It was one of the greatest tactical victories in history, still studied in military schools to this very day. What made both men remarkable was not just their strategies, but their understanding of the human spirit. Shaka knew that unity and discipline turned farmers into warriors, and warriors into an unbreakable nation. Hannibal knew that courage and surprise could turn even a smaller force into a blade sharp enough to cut down empires. They both fought, not with numbers alone, but with minds that reached beyond the battlefield. Shaka's warriors began to march with pride, knowing that under his command, they were more than men. They were the heartbeat of a kingdom. Hannibal's soldiers, hardened by the Alps and bonded by his daring, followed him with loyalty that no hunger, no storm, no enemy could break. In their strategies, Africa spoke. It said, "We are not only strength of body, but strength of mind. We are not only the roar of battle, but the wisdom of victory." And so the world watched, some in fear, others in awe. Shaka was becoming the thunder of the South. Hannibal was becoming the shadow that haunted Rome. Two commanders, far apart in time, yet marching in the same spirit, Africa's spirit. The weight of power is not light. It does not sit gently on the shoulders. It presses down like a mountain, testing whether the one who carries it will stand tall or be crushed. Both Shaka Zulu and Hannibal Barca rose to command, but with command came the heavy burden of choices that shape not only battles, but the destiny of nations. Shaka's rise to leadership after the death of Dingiswayo was sudden, and it was fierce. The Zulu, once a small clan, now stood at the center of power. With every victory, more clans were drawn into Shaka's vision of unity, whether by alliance or by conquest. To his warriors, he was a father and a fire, a man who demanded discipline, yet gave them pride. He abolished old rituals that weakened his army, demanded that men march barefoot to harden their feet, and allowed no man to marry until he had proven himself in battle. The weight of his crown was heavy. He carried the dreams of a people who had long been scattered and vulnerable. In his hands, the Zulu nation became a single spear aimed at the heart of southern Africa. But with that spear came fear. Chiefs who once resisted him bent their knees, but some whispered that Shaka's rule was too harsh, his punishments too cruel, his ambition too vast. To hold power, he had to rule with fire, for he knew that if his grip loosened, everything he built would shatter. Hannibal too felt the crushing weight of command. After crossing the Alps, he stood not as a raider, but as the master of Italy's soil. City after city turned to his side, inspired by his daring and his victories. Yet Rome, though bloodied, did not fall. The Senate called up army after army, each larger than the last. Though Hannibal won again and again, he carried the burden of distance. His city, Carthage, was far away. His people grew hesitant, his leaders cautious, unwilling to give him the full support he needed to break Rome completely. In those moments of frustration, Hannibal must have felt the true loneliness of power. He could outthink Rome's greatest generals, he could crush armies twice his size, but he could not always bend the will of his own city. His soldiers looked to him for food, for leadership, for survival. His allies looked to him for victories. Yet who carried him? Who bore his weight? The burden of a commander is often unseen, but it is heavy enough to bend the strongest back. Shaka and Hannibal both knew the price of power. It was written in sleepless nights, in the silence after battle when the dead lay still, in the eyes of men who questioned whether victory was worth the cost. They knew that to command was not simply to fight, but to sacrifice, sometimes even the love of their own people, and yet they carried that weight. Shaka stood tall, uniting his people into a nation that would echo through generations. Hannibal pressed forward, never defeated in open battle, carrying Carthage's pride even in the heart of enemy lands. The ancestors must have watched them both and whispered, "This is the price of greatness. This is the burden of Africa's sons." And so, the story deepened. These were no longer boys rising, nor warriors proving themselves. They were commanders in full, standing at the center of storms, holding nations in their hands, and knowing that history itself was watching. Enemies on all sides. Greatness does not live without enemies. The higher a man rises, the sharper the arrows aimed at his back. For Shaka Zulu and Hannibal Barca, the world did not give them their crowns freely. Every victory drew more enemies, and every step forward came with the risk of betrayal. For Shaka, enemies came not only from outside his growing kingdom, but from within it. As he expanded the Zulu nation, swallowing clan after clan, there were chiefs who hated him for taking away their power. Whispers grew in the shadows. Some called him too cruel, others feared his punishments. Yet still his warriors followed him, for they saw how his discipline kept them strong, how his vision gave them a future larger than their fathers had ever imagined. Beyond his borders, rival chiefs gathered their armies, hoping to strike down the young lion before his claws grew too sharp. The Zulu Kingdom, powerful and proud, stood as the greatest threat. They mocked the Zulu, calling them upstarts, believing their numbers would crush Shaka's smaller army. But Shaka had no fear. He trusted in the horns of his bull formation, in the courage of his soldiers, and in the knowledge that unity was stronger than numbers. When battle came, the earth itself trembled with the sound of Zulu feet. Shaka's strategy broke the Ndwandwe, scattering their power and proving to all who doubted that the Zulu Kingdom was not a flicker of fire, but a rising sun. For Hannibal, enemies were everywhere. The Romans feared him like a nightmare that would not fade. After Cannae, where he destroyed the mightiest army Rome had ever fielded, the Senate trembled but did not surrender. Instead, they turned their entire empire into a fortress, refusing to face him directly, bleeding him slowly with endless resistance. Cities that once promised loyalty sometimes turned traitor, choosing safety in Rome's shadow over courage under Carthage's banner. Worse still, Hannibal's greatest enemy often sat not across the battlefield but across the sea. The leaders of Carthage, jealous of his fame, fearful of his ambition, refused him the reinforcements he needed. He had carried their name into glory, but they gave him only silence in return. His victories, though legendary, grew heavy without support. He was a lion surrounded not only by Roman swords, but by the doubt of his own city. Shaka and Hannibal both learned that enemies are not only men who march with spears and shields. Enemies can be whispers in the dark, betrayal in the council, hesitation from those who should stand beside you. The battlefield is wide, and not all wars are fought with weapons, and yet both men stood unbroken. Shaka faced the Ndwandwe and proved the strength of his new Zulu nation. Hannibal faced the endless legions of Rome and remained undefeated in battle for more than a decade. Their enemies struck from every side, but they endured, for they were not ordinary men. They were commanders who carried Africa's spirit in their blood. The story of these leaders is a reminder that greatness is not measured by the absence of enemies, but by the courage to face them. Shaka's kingdom grew, even as rivals plotted. Hannibal's legend spread, even as Carthage betrayed him. Both stood firm like mountains against the storm, their names carried by the wind across generations. And so the world learned this truth. The lion is most dangerous when the hunters close in. Blood and sacrifice great commanders are remembered for their victories, but their people remember also the blood that was spilled along the way. Shaka Zulu and Hannibal Barca carried the pride of nations, yet every step forward was paid for in sacrifice. Shaka's wars were not battles alone. They were storms that reshaped the land of southern Africa. As his armies grew, he demanded more of his warriors than any chief before him. They marched without sandals, their feet hardened by the earth. They carried heavy shields, their arms shaped like stone from endless training. They slept little, ate little, and were drilled until their bodies no longer belonged to themselves, but to the kingdom. Some hated him for this, but the results could not be denied. His warriors were faster, stronger, and more disciplined than any enemy they faced. Still, the price was high. Young men fell on battlefields, their blood soaking the soil. Families wept, mothers wailed, but Shaka's vision never wavered. He believed the sacrifice of today built the freedom of tomorrow. To him, pain was not cruelty, it was the fire that forged a nation. For Hannibal, the sacrifices were even greater. The march across the Alps alone was a river of suffering. Thousands of soldiers froze to death in the snow, slipping from icy cliffs or falling beneath the weight of hunger. Elephants, the pride of Carthage, collapsed in the cold, their mighty bodies lying still against the mountainsides. Yet Hannibal pressed on, carrying the survivors into Italy, their eyes burning with the knowledge that their suffering was not in vain. Even in victory, Hannibal's men bled endlessly. At Cannae, though he crushed Rome's legions, his own soldiers lay scattered across the field, comrades who had given their last breath to carve Carthage's name into history. And as the years stretched on, the sacrifices deepened. His men grew weary, their numbers thinned, yet they followed him still. They did not fight only for pay or for Carthage. They fought because Hannibal carried their spirit, because his vision was larger than life. Both leaders lived with the weight of these sacrifices. Shaka, in his moments of silence, must have felt the cries of his people in his chest, even as he sharpened the next spear. Hannibal, as he rode past the graves of his fallen soldiers, must have carried their ghosts with him, each step a reminder of the cost of greatness. But neither man turned away. They knew that history is not written with ink, but with blood. The soil remembers, and the ancestors remember. And in that memory, a people's pride is kept alive. For the Zulu, the blood of their sons built a kingdom that no enemy could ignore. For Carthage, the sacrifice of Hannibal's soldiers carved fear into the heart of Rome, a fear so deep that centuries later, his name would still be spoken with awe. In their sacrifice lay their immortality. For Africa, these commanders proved that the continent's warriors did not kneel before hardship, but rose through it. Their enemies thought the suffering would break them, but instead it sharpened them into legends. The story of blood and sacrifice is not a tale of weakness. It is a tale of endurance. It is the voice of the ancestors saying, "Our children will bleed, but they will not bow. Our children will fall, but they will rise again, stronger, louder, unbroken." And so Shaka and Hannibal walked their paths, their footsteps heavy with the weight of sacrifice, their eyes fixed on the horizon of destiny. The shadow of empire. The sun rose heavy and red, casting a long shadow across the lands both men sought to command. For Shaka Zulu and Hannibal Barca, victory was not simply the clash of spears and swords. It was the weight of empire pressing against them, testing their every move, their every word, their every dream. Shaka Zulu's empire had spread like fire across the hills of southern Africa. Small clans, once scattered and fragile, had been gathered into a single storm under his rule. Where once there had been dozens of divided chiefs, now there was one king, one vision, one army that moved with the strength of thunder. His enemies could no longer fight him as individuals. They banded together, forming alliances of fear, trying desperately to slow the march of the Zulu. And yet, with every alliance broken, with every village brought into his fold, Shaka grew more powerful and more isolated. Power has two faces, one that shines like the sun and one that burns like fire. Those who followed him gave him loyalty, but some also gave him suspicion. Whispers began to grow. Had Shaka become too harsh? Did he care more for conquest than for the people's breath? These murmurs haunted his nights, but they never broke his stride. To Shaka, doubt was weakness, and weakness had no place in the kingdom he was building. For Hannibal, the shadow of empire was Rome itself. Carthage was a proud city, rich and strong, but Rome was relentless, a beast that refused to be tamed. Even after his great victory at Cannae, where tens of thousands of Roman soldiers lay crushed beneath his genius, the empire did not fall. Rome bled, but it did not break. It rebuilt, it grew, it adapted, like a wounded lion refusing to die. This was the true challenge for Hannibal. He had marched across the Alps, stunned the world with elephants, carved his name into history, yet still the shadow of Rome loomed over him. Every victory demanded more men, more supplies, more sacrifices, and Carthage, far away across the sea, could not always give him what he needed. He fought not just against Rome's soldiers, but against Rome's unyielding will. It was here, in this struggle, that Shaka and Hannibal's stories intertwined in spirit, though they lived in different centuries. Both faced enemies larger than life, enemies that seemed endless. Both knew that to lead was to stand against storms so vast that most men would run. Shaka looked at his empire and saw cracks forming in the foundation, not from weakness of his soldiers, but from the fear of his people, fear of endless war, fear of his temper, fear of what his power might become. He had lifted his people to greatness, yet greatness came with a price, and not all were willing to pay it. Hannibal looked at his army, loyal yet tired. Years of war had worn them down. His men were not Carthaginians alone, but a mix of Africans, Spaniards, Gauls, and others who had sworn to fight with him. Their unity was his strength, yet it was fragile. The longer the war stretched, the more they wondered. Would Carthage send reinforcements? Would their sacrifices mean anything if Rome still stood? And yet, both leaders carried the same fire. For them, retreat was unthinkable. They did not measure victory only in land or treasure. They measured it in spirit, in the pride of their people, in the legacy that would echo across generations. Shaka stood tall before his warriors, reminding them that the Zulu Kingdom was built on fear, but on courage. "We are not many tribes," he told them. "We are one, and as long as we are one, no empire, no alliance, no enemy can break us." His words carried across the fields like the beat of a war drum, silencing doubt, filling his men with pride. Hannibal, too, rallied his soldiers with words that pierced deeper than swords. "Rome bleeds because of us," he told them, "and though they rise again, know this. The world now speaks our name. The world remembers what we have done. You do not fight for Carthage alone. You fight for history itself." His men, weary and scarred, found strength in his vision. They followed him not only because he was their commander, but because he carried their spirit higher than they thought possible. But shadows lingered. In Carthage, politics whispered against Hannibal. Envy and fear poisoned the support he needed. In Shaka's kingdom, betrayal brewed in the hearts of those who felt his hand too heavy. The shadows of empire were not just external. They came from within, eating away at loyalty, testing the strength of the leader himself. This is the cruel truth of greatness. The higher a man climbs, the more the shadows reach for him. Shaka and Hannibal stood at the heights of power, yet they both felt the cold breath of betrayal behind them. Still, they did not falter. They marched forward, leading their armies with a defiance that history has never forgotten. For Africa, their stories became more than battles. They became symbols. Shaka's Zulu Kingdom showed that Africans could forge nations of power, unity, and pride. Hannibal's war against Rome showed that an African commander could stand against the mightiest empire the world had ever seen and shake it to its core. The shadows of empire could not erase their light. Instead, the shadows proved the brightness of that light, for only the brightest flames cast the darkest shadows. Today, when Africans look back on Shaka and Hannibal, they see not only warriors, but men who stood unbroken in the face of impossible odds. Men who understood that to be a commander is not to escape the shadow, but to walk through it with your head unbowed. The story of empire is never simple. It is glory and blood, triumph and betrayal, pride and loss. But through it all, Shaka Zulu and Hannibal Barca remind us of a truth that lives in the heart of Africa. No empire, no matter how vast, can silence the spirit of a people who refuse to bow. And so, as the shadow of empire stretched across their paths, both men pressed forward, knowing the road ahead was steep, knowing betrayal lurked near, but walking anyway. For that is what makes a commander. Not just the victories, not just the armies, but the courage to march even when the shadow grows darkest. Betrayal in the ranks, the winds of power are fickle. They lift men high, but they also whisper of downfall. For Shaka Zulu and Hannibal Barca, betrayal was not a stranger waiting at the gates of their enemies. It lived closer, within their very walls, within the hearts of those they trusted most. Shaka Zulu, the spear of the Zulu nation, had forged a kingdom unmatched in southern Africa. His warriors, drilled in the deadly art of close combat, had become the terror of every rival chiefdom. His reforms had reshaped not only the way battles were fought, but the way people lived, the way they saw themselves as one Zulu nation rather than scattered tribes. Yet the same fire that made him great also burned those who stood too close. Shaka's grip on power grew tighter after the death of his beloved mother, Nandi. Grief consumed him, and in his mourning he demanded impossible sacrifices from his people. Crops were left unplanted, milk forbidden to be drunk, children starved in tribute to his sorrow. For some, this was proof that their king had lost balance, that his greatness had turned to madness. For his loyal warriors, it was an order, not to be questioned, but in the hearts of his family, doubt and resentment began to bloom. It was in this shadow that betrayal took root. Dingain and Malangana, Shaka's half-brothers, men who had lived under his protection, now saw a chance to claim the throne. They whispered in dark corners, promising a kingdom gentler, a rule more merciful. To the weary and fearful, their words sounded like hope. To Shaka, had he known, they would have sounded like the hiss of a snake. Far across the Mediterranean, Hannibal Barca too faced betrayal, though not from blood, but from the very city he bled for. Carthage, proud and rich, had long been divided by politics. Hannibal's victories in Italy had shaken Rome to its core, yet his enemies in Carthage whispered against him. They claimed he sought too much power, that his campaigns drained the city's wealth, that perhaps peace with Rome was safer than war. The irony was bitter. Hannibal had fought to defend Carthage's honor, to protect it from Roman domination, and yet many of Carthage's leaders feared him more than they feared Rome itself. They starved his armies of reinforcements, sent only minimal supplies, and at times left him abandoned on foreign soil. His victories were carved not with the backing of his homeland, but in spite of its doubts. Like Shaka, Hannibal knew what it was to be betrayed, not by enemies, but by those who should have stood at his side. The night before Shaka's fall was heavy with silence. His brothers had gathered their conspirators, warriors loyal not to Shaka, but to the promise of new rule. The air in the royal kraal trembled with tension, though most did not yet know what storm would break by dawn. Shaka, ever commanding, continued his plans for expansion, speaking of new conquests, of pushing the borders of the Zulu Kingdom farther than ever before. His mind was still on empire, not on the knives being sharpened behind him. For Hannibal, betrayal unfolded more. Slowly, like a sickness that spreads unseen until it cannot be cured. Year after year, as his army held ground in Italy, Carthage failed to deliver the support he needed to deliver the final blow. The reinforcements that might have crushed Rome never came. The gold that could have fed his soldiers was spent elsewhere. Hannibal's name was celebrated by his men, but in the halls of Carthage it was spoken with envy, suspicion, and fear. Still, he fought on. Like Shaka, Hannibal believed that the will of a commander could defy even betrayal. He carried not only strategy but spirit, convincing his soldiers that their cause was still alive. Even as the political will of his city withered behind him. Betrayal is a storm that comes when the skies look clear. For Shaka, it came in the moment he least expected. His brothers approached, speaking softly, pretending loyalty, until spears were drawn, and the king who had forged an empire fell beneath their blades. The Zulu Kingdom did not crumble with him. It lived on under Dingain, but the light of its greatest warrior was extinguished by his own blood, for Hannibal betrayal did not come as a single stab in the dark. It came as years of erosion, as his city stripped him of command, as Rome rebuilt its strength, and as Carthage in its fear surrendered to its enemy. Hannibal lived long enough to see his city weakened, long enough to feel the weight of exile, hunted by Rome until he chose death over capture. Yet in both men, betrayal could not erase greatness. The brothers who killed Shaka inherited his throne, but never his legend. Carthage's politicians may have distrusted Hannibal, but Rome itself remembered him with awe and fear for centuries. This is the cruel lesson of betrayal. It can silence a voice. It can end a life. It can halt an army, but it cannot erase the truth of what was built. Shaka's Zulu Kingdom remained a power in Africa long after his death. Hannibal's genius reshaped the very way Rome thought about war. Today, when Africans remember Shaka Zulu, they do not remember him as the man who fell to betrayal. They remember him as the warrior who made the Zulu nation stand proud. When the world remembers Hannibal Barca, they do not remember him as the general abandoned by his city. They remember him as the man who shook Rome, the empire that seemed unshakable. And so, the story of betrayal is not only a story of loss. It is a story of endurance, of the way greatness survives even when the men themselves are struck down. The proud sons and daughters of Africa know this truth well. Betrayal may wound, but it cannot kill the spirit of a people. Just as Shaka and Hannibal rose from their own trials to command history, Africa rises again and again, no matter how many shadows gather. For in the end, betrayal is only a chapter. Greatness is the book. The legacy of Lion's history is a river. It flows across centuries, carrying the stories of those who lived, fought, dreamed, and fell. Some names are washed away, forgotten in the current. Others remain etched into the stones of memory, unmovable, immortal. Among these, two lions stand side by side, Shaka Zulu of the south and Hannibal Barca of the north. Though their lives were separated by continents and centuries, their stories echo as if they were brothers, born of the same fire. Both were warriors who carried the weight of their people upon their shoulders. Both fought empires greater in number and resources. Both turned fear into a weapon, courage into a shield, and leadership into a force that outlived them. Shaka Zulu rose from the hardships of rejection, a boy marked by struggle, to become the architect of a nation. He reimagined war itself, shaping his warriors into a living storm. With the short stabbing spear, the disciplined formations, and the relentless drive of his vision, Shaka transformed scattered clans into the mighty Zulu Kingdom. To his enemies, he was a terror. To his people, he was the father of unity. Hannibal Barca grew in the shadow of Rome, a child sworn by his father to eternal struggle. From the hills of Carthage to the icy Alps, he carried that oath like fire. In his blood, he marched an army across mountains no one dared to cross, faced legions 10 times his number, and shattered Rome's pride on their own soil. His genius was not only in battle, but in the way he taught his men to believe that no obstacle was greater than their will. Their ends were heavy with betrayal, yet their legacies were not defined by the daggers of brothers or the cowardice of politicians. They were defined by the roar of the people who remembered. Shaka fell to the jealousy of kin, but the Zulu nation endured, carried forward by the reforms he had carved into the bones of history. Hannibal was exiled by the envy of his city, but his name lived in Rome's nightmares and in the whispered awe of generals centuries later. What makes a commander immortal? It is not merely victory, for victories fade. It is not merely conquest, for borders shift and kingdoms crumble. Immortality is born when a leader gives their people something more lasting than land, pride, courage, and the unshakable belief that they can rise. This is what Shaka and Hannibal gave to Africa, to the young man in Johannesburg who dreams of leading his community, to the young woman in Lagos who fights for her education, to the farmer in Kenya who refuses to bow to hardship, to the voices across the continent demanding dignity and respect. Shaka and Hannibal are not just figures in dusty books. They are reminders that Africa has always produced giants. Their legacy is also a warning. Both men were undone not by the strength of their enemies, but by the weakness within their own homes. Hannibal might have taken Rome if Carthage had stood behind him. Shaka might have reigned longer if his brothers had embraced loyalty over envy. Betrayal cost Africa 2 of its brightest flames. Yet even in that loss, there is a lesson of power. The strength of Africa does not lie in one man or one woman, but in unity. A divided house cannot stand, but a united people can shape empires. That is why the memory of Shaka and Hannibal must not only inspire pride, but also wisdom. Greatness must be guarded from within as fiercely as it is defended from without. Today, their statues may not stand in every city. Their names may not be on every tongue, but in the beating heart of Africa, their spirit is alive. It is alive in the rhythm of drums, in the songs of warriors, in the dreams of children who refuse to believe they are small. Imagine Shaka and Hannibal meeting beyond time, not as strangers but as brothers. The Zulu king, spear in hand, and the Carthaginian general astride his war elephant, standing at the edge of a sunrise. Around them, not Zulu warriors nor Carthaginian soldiers, but the sons and daughters of Africa today. Shaka would look upon them and say, "Be strong, for unity is strength." Hannibal would nod and add, "Be bold, for no mountain is too high." Together they would declare, "You are the heirs of our fire. Walk tall, Africa. The world may forget our names, but you carry our blood. And as long as you rise, so do we." And so the story closes, not as an ending, but as a beginning. Shaka Zulu, the lion of the south. Hannibal Barca, the eagle of the north. Two commanders separated by time, united in legacy. Their lives were battles, their deaths were betrayals, but their memory is triumph. The river of history carries them still, unbroken, untamed. They are not only the past, they are the voice in the wind telling Africa, "You are great, and you will be greater still." Shaka's spear carved unity, Hannibal's march carved courage, and together their spirit declares to every African man and woman today, no empire is greater than your strength, no enemy is stronger than your will.